Alright, so people massively overcomplicate their workouts. Like, they might just mix and match a bunch of different movements together, do like 5 sets of an exercise, or just do something that their favorite influencer taught them to and not stick to something consistently. So today I'm going to tell you how to program an upper day, which is part of an upper-lower split. So you'll know exactly what to do in the gym, you won't be guessing, and you'll have a plan to stick to consistently. Right, so before we dive into the exercises, let's talk about what makes an upper day effective. So you want to be hitting your entire upper body, which means you're hitting your chest, you're hitting your back, you're hitting your shoulders and your arms all in the same day. This is an excellent idea because it allows for a higher frequency throughout the week. So instead of doing a traditional push-pull legs workout, you could be doing an upper-lower workout, which means that you get your whole upper body done in one day. This means that you'll be able to hit the muscle groups sooner than if you did a push-pull leg split, or you'd have less days in between workouts. People just tend to do too much volume overall, and in addition they don't train hard enough, which is why they're able to do too much volume. But with the upper day, it's vital that you get your intensity and your effort right, so you can make the most out of the volume that I've programmed here. So essentially doing an upper body day means that you have just the right amount of volume that you should be doing in a session that lasts around 45 minutes, and it allows for more frequency. So let's put this into practice. Right, so you should always start with the muscle group that is your biggest priority. So for example, if your biggest priority, which is chest, do all your chest movements first. And if your arms are your biggest priority, you should do your arm movements first. And yes, this even means if it gets in the way of subsequent movements, because they're your priority, right? So for your chest, I think that doing 2 different movements is a good idea, which is one for the upper chest biasing movements, because there's 2 main functions of the chest, which is shoulder flexion and then adduction, bringing your arm to the midline of your body. That's what the chest does, right? It also technically does internal rotation, but we're not going to be training that. So for the upper chest, you could be doing upper pec bias press, where you're aiming to get a lot of shoulder flexion in the exercise. So you're keeping your elbows tucked into your body and pushing up like this, right? So you could be doing that through an incline Smith machine press or any sort of incline press variation. They all work pretty similarly. The difference really isn't going to be that much. And then in addition, you could also do a low to high incline cable fly like this. That would work incredibly well, which is actually my personal favorite. Both of these exercises do train the whole chest. However, these exercises do bias the clavicular head a bit more, so it still trains your whole chest. Then we could move on to a movement of biasing the middle and lower pecs, which is just any sort of horizontal adduction challenge, right? So this could be any sort of flat press, pec deck, literally any sort of press like that. My favorite exercise is just the pec deck. I just think it's an excellent exercise. It's a single jointed exercise, which means that there is going to be more motor unit recruitment on the pec, so it's just excellent. Again, you can just do a flat press as well, because it's pretty much the same thing as a pec deck, right? It trains the exact same function of the chest. So putting that all together, I mean, you typically want around 3 to 4 sets per muscle group per session. You can do a little bit more, you can do a little bit less. It just depends on your individual ability to recover. And you can also do these exercises in any order that you want. It doesn't really necessarily matter. It just depends on your priorities. However, I would say that doing a compound exercise first is probably going to be your better option. So for example, if I was to do an incline Smith machine press and a pec deck, I would put the incline Smith machine press first, just because you're going to need more energy and it's going to be a lot more taxing to do. So it just makes sense to put it front. And then in addition, if I have 3 sets to work with, right, I would probably do 1 for the compound and then 2 for the isolation, simply just because compound exercises take a lot more energy to do. Right, so the back is just so much simpler than people make it out to be. Honestly, it's probably one of the most complicated or overcomplicated muscle groups out there, right? Like, so many people think that you need to do all these different exercises, and when I started, it was very confusing for me too. All you need to do for the back is 2 movements. One that focuses on scapular retraction, and then the other one that focuses on any sort of adduction, shoulder adduction like this. And that's pretty much it for most people. The upper back consists of the traps, the rhomboids, teres major, depends on your definition, and then your rear delts also depends on your definition because they're technically your shoulders. But the upper back exercises work your rear delts incredibly well. So for the upper back exercise, I just think any sort of chest supported row variation is going to be perfect. So my favorite is a T-bar row, or any sort of machine supported, or any sort of machine row like you can even use the one that's commonly found in Pure Gym, is going to be great. Any sort of variation will be good, and that will cover your whole upper back, and that's that done. You don't need to worry about anything else. And then we can move on to the lats. So the lats do shoulder extension and then shoulder adduction, and there is a little bit debate online whether you can bias the lat fibers. However, I personally have changed my opinion on this. I think that you can. So what I would personally do is I would do one set of a frontal plane pull down and then one set of a sagittal plane pull down. So the frontal plane pull down would more focus on the lower lats. Now it does work your whole lat, right? It works the whole muscle. However, there is some evidence to suggest that it would bias the lower lat fibers. And a frontal plane pull down is essentially just your typical lat pull down and the typical bar that everyone uses in the gym. That's the kind of like straight bar that's kind of curved, you know what I'm talking about. And then for a sagittal plane pull down, I would just do any sort of the attachments that allow your arms to be in like this, and that will target or bias more of your upper lat fibers. So putting this all together, it will just look like this. Okay, we'll have 2 sets of a chest supported row, and then 1 set of a frontal plane pull down, 1 set of a sagittal plane pull down. That's your back done. Your teres major gets trained throughout these pull down movements. You can't bias it, that's just how it works. Now we also need to work on our shoulders. Now there was a massive propaganda for years talking about how front delts is not something that needs to be trained because you get an adequate amount of volume throughout your regular pressing. But this is fucking bullshit, right? We need to be training your front delt. The best way to do this is just some regular overhead press. It's as simple as that. Just any sort of overhead press. You could do a machine overhead press, dumbbell overhead press, barbell, preferably sitting. I wouldn't really recommend the standing. And then that'll get your front delt adequately. I will say one thing though, when you're doing overhead presses, you should probably stop at parallel, because if you go any lower, you're going to get a lot more side delt activation. So if you stop at parallel, go up like this, you'll get a lot more tension on your front delts. And then of course we have to isolate our side delts. Incredibly important. Side delt is probably the most important muscle when it comes to looking wider and looking more aesthetic. So any sort of side delt variation is going to work perfectly fine. I mean, there was literature recently that came out that showed that there wasn't any sort of significant difference when it came to outcomes of variation to side delt or lateral raises. So any cable raise, any dumbbell raise is going to work perfectly fine. I would speculate that doing some sort of machine raise is going to be better just because inherently it has more stability. It doesn't really matter. So again, putting this together, I would do 1 set of a shoulder press and then 2 sets of a lateral raise. Then we have the arms. Of course we have to train the arms here. Probably the most important muscle group to train to look the best because they're the first thing that people notice. So arm isolation is incredibly important, right? So when it comes to the triceps, the long head works a little bit differently to the medial and lateral head. Yes, they all extend the elbow. However, the long head has less leverage when the arm is raised up like this. So when you're doing an overhead movement, it's going to train more of your medial and lateral head. So that would be the best way to bias those heads. Doing some sort of overhead extension is going to be incredibly beneficial. And then for the long head, you can just do a simple garden variety push down where your arms are in line with your body like this, like tucked in. You can't see that, but yeah. And then the bicep is an incredibly simple muscle. All it does is flex the elbow, right? That's all you need to worry about. So any sort of movement which flexes the elbow like this is going to be perfectly fine for your biceps. Any sort of bicep curl variation. My personal favorite is a preacher curl. So putting that together, I would do 1 set of an overhead extension, 1 set of a tricep push down, and then 2 sets of a regular preacher curl. So putting it all together, it would look something like this. Wait, actually, before I say that, the volume that I have put here is arbitrary because it's so dependent on the individual how much you can recover from, and this volume is what works for me in particular, and it might be completely different to you. You might be able to do slightly more or slightly less. It does take some trial and error to actually get this right. But anyway, this is what it looks like together. It's simple, it's effective, and it will get you a long way. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you did, please give a like and subscribe to my channel. I am Mew, and if you want a personalized plan that's completely dedicated for you, check out my one-on-one online coaching or my training guides at scottcreasypt.com. Okay, thanks, bye.